Today we're going to be talking about consequentialism, or really consequentialisms. We're going to be talking about a variety of moral theories that are very closely related to one another, but nevertheless differ in a few ways, differ in what they take as their basic units of analysis. All nevertheless count as versions of consequentialism. To set the stage here, I think it will be helpful for me to sketch out a little picture of what goes on in moral decision making and deliberation. Suppose I am trying to make a decision. So there's me. And I'm thinking about what to do about a situation, so I'm contemplating. And as I contemplate, what am I really doing? What is going on in the process of my decision making? Any ethical theory, a theory about what kind of person to be and what to do and how to decide, has to think about what is a model here for what goes on in the process of deliberation. What does it mean to make a decision? Well, one of the things that I do, surely, is identify a range of options from which I have to choose. So if I'm thinking, what's going on in my head, part of it is there is this range of options that I identify. And then I have to decide what I'm going to do about that range of options. I do that in relation to some goal I have. And so there is some kind of goal I have in mind, and I want this action to be one that leads to the goal. So I'm going to try to find a way of selecting among these options. Now, what am I going to do? Well, in the process of thinking about this, I'm going to presumably think, okay, if I have that goal, then what exactly do I want to accomplish here? What are the parts of this? How do I attain that goal? So I'm going to be directing means toward an end, but in the process of doing that, I am going to be thinking in terms of, well, my motivations. Okay, maybe I want this and care about that, but I also have this other goal. I want that and I want this one. And so there might be multiple goals here that I have in mind. And in addition to that, you might say there might be multiple motives that I have in relation to those goals. Out of those, I make some selection. So I enter into a process thinking about the options and my motives and my goals of making a decision. And out of that decision, I form an intention to act in a certain way, and then I actually act in that way. Well, my action then has a variety of effects. And so it has certain consequences. Certain things result from my action. And then I can compare those consequences to the goals that I had and see how well I did. Now, of course, there are various things that shape this in the background. So, for example, yes, I'm thinking about these motives and goals in relation to my range of options. And so one of the things that delimits all of this and affects it is just the conditions in the world. I may have many options or very few options. But of course, part of it is, in addition to just the world shaping this, my own character shapes this. And in addition to my own character, that leads me to consider certain options and rank them in certain ways, evaluate them in certain ways, have certain goals, and so forth. There are also other things, so a variety of additional factors, including the various social institutions that I'm a part of, and then ultimately, I suppose, the entire civilization that I'm part of. All of those things are going to be shaping the way I think about these problems. Now, the reason I talk about this is that with respect to a consequentialist moral theory, or for that matter, any moral theory, we have to make two kinds of decisions. One, we have to decide what is our basic unit of analysis? Where are we going to think about where to make the, you might say, fundamental evaluation of what's better than what, of what's a good action, what's a bad action, what I ought to do. I'm going to think in terms of what exactly? Well, the consequentialist says, I'm going to think in terms of consequences. And so one way to think about consequentialism is to say, I'm going to focus primarily on this and characterize what it is to be a good consequence or a bad consequence. And then I will try to understand all the rest of this in terms of acting in such a way that I produce good consequences. You could do things very differently. For example, you could be Aristotle and focus on virtue And then you might say, I'm going to focus on character at the other end of this and think hard about it and take it as my basic unit. I'm going to think the primary question is what kind of person I should be. And then when I make a decision, I'm going to think, what would a person like that do? Of course, there are other options. I might look at the method of decision itself, and in another lecture soon coming up, we'll be talking about that. But the consequentialist says, well, however exactly we arrange this, this is really what we're aiming at. This is our ultimate measure of success, of what it is to act well, to act badly, to be a good person, bad person, and so on. We test it by consequences, hence the name consequentialism. The other thing I have to decide is, well, what do I want to relate to that most directly? Is it action? Is it something else? And indeed, the versions of consequentialism we're going to talk about today vary with respect to that. They say, I care primarily about consequences, but consequences of what? The most obvious thing to say is action. And so most often one encounters versions of consequentialism that are act consequentialist. They say, I'm going to look primarily at the consequences of actions. But you could also say, I'm going to focus primarily on the consequences of having certain motives or goals, on the consequences of having a certain character, on the consequences of being part of a certain institution, or the consequences of a civilization, and so on. So there are various places in here you could say, I care mostly about the consequences of this, and then I try to understand all the rest in those terms. So let's take a look at how the basic approach of consequentialism works out as we try to develop a theory. Consequentialism is, as I understand it, primarily a theory about what is better than what. It is not primarily a theory that tries to draw a line between good actions and bad actions, the end, or to tell you exactly what your obligations are and what is prohibited. It is not mostly a theory about thou shalts and thou shalt nots. Here is, I take it, the fundamental idea behind consequentialism. X, whatever X is, whether it's an action or a rule for action or a motive or a character trait or an entire civilization, X is more preferable to Y if X tends to lead to better consequences than Y does. We're going to talk later about all the dimensions of this idea of starting with what makes something better than. Here I've said X is morally preferable, but you could just say is better than. That would be simpler. I don't know why I didn't do that. X is better than Y, right? It's a better thing if it leads to better consequences. That's the entire idea. So if we apply that to acts, we're going to be thinking one act is better than another if it has better consequences. If we think about rules for action, we're going to say that rule is better if it leads to better consequences. We think about a motive, that motive is better if it leads to better consequences. We think about a method of decision. That decision method is better if it leads to better consequences. A character trait. This one's better than that one if it leads to better consequences. Is it really true that pride is better than humility, or that humility is better than pride? Which one has better consequences? And then we can ask the same thing about institutions, about entire civilizations, about all sorts of things. So there can be many versions of this thought. But nevertheless, the basic idea is this thing is better than that thing if it has better consequences. End of story. Well, in a way, that's simple enough. Notice this is something that says the moral value derives entirely from the consequences. Everything else is built on top of consequences. And that's what gives it the name, consequentialism. We could take that as a definition of consequentialism, the view that moral value derives entirely from consequences. Here is one version. It's a version of act consequentialism in Jeremy Bentham, and this is one we're going to look at in great detail later. By the principle of utility, Bentham says, is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what's the same thing, in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. What is this saying? It's saying, my theory approves or disapproves any action whatsoever. Action, notice. So we're talking about actions here. So my theory approves this action to this extent. So we're talking about really putting things on a scale of, the degree of approval. So we're talking about what's better than what. And he's saying this action is better if it appears to have a greater tendency to contribute to happiness. Whose happiness? Well, the happiness of people affected by that action. Sometimes it might just be the actor, the person who's doing it. Nobody else is really affected. Maybe it's a small group of people. Maybe it's a very large group. Maybe it's the entire world. So it depends. Most of us don't have that much impact on that many people, but some people do have tremendous impact on billions of people. So Bentham means it to apply in all these situations. We have to think, well, how does this affect the happiness of those people? Happiness here is the kind of consequence he cares about. But we could understand the nature of consequences and what makes them good and bad in different ways and still be a consequentialist. Here's another version. It's also a version of act consequentialism in John Stuart Mill, who was a student of Jeremy Bentham. In fact, Mill was taught, homeschooled as a child by two people, James Mill, his father, a famous economist, and also Jeremy Bentham. Mill says the creed that accepts the foundation of morals as utility or the greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Again, happiness is the measure. We look at consequences, we say, what do they contribute or detract from happiness? An action is right in proportion to its tendency to promote happiness. And so we say this act is better than this action if it has a greater tendency to promote happiness. Well, we're looking there at actions, and we're focusing on happiness as our measure of the goodness of a consequence. But it's clearly a version of consequentialism. We're looking at the consequences of actions and judging them. So in this form of consequentialism, act consequentialism, we look at the consequences of action and the relationship between an act and its consequences. But that's not the only version of consequentialism that there is. We could also focus on rules for action or policies. That's something that is a generalization, you might say, about how to act. And if we're contemplating rules for action, whether it's an informal social rule or a formal law or regulation, we can think about it in these terms. Now, you might think, well, is this rule one that leads to actions that lead to good consequences? That's still a form of act utilitarianism. Actions and their consequences are primary. But you could also say, I want to focus just on the rule. What are the consequences of adopting this rule? And that gives you a version of rule consequentialism. Maybe the first person to advance a theory like that, although actually I think Maimonides may have had such a version, but the first one to clearly articulate this is Bishop Berkeley. In framing the general laws of nature, it's granted we must be entirely guided by the public good of mankind, but not in the ordinary moral actions of our lives. The rule is framed with respect to the good of mankind, but our practice must always be shaped immediately by the rule. In other words, he's saying we think about rules in terms of the consequences. We try to pick out what's the best rule, and then we adapt our actions to that rule. So what should you do? Well, the act consequentialist says, act so that your action promotes the best consequences. Basically, prefer to act in a way that is better with respect to the consequences, usually promoting happiness. Berkeley says, actually follow the rule. That is the best rule for producing happiness. Now, there's a possible tension here, as we'll see. It could be that there is a rule that's a very good rule, but in this case, it's better to break it. It might be that there are situations where actually I would not want this to be a general rule, but in this case, it seems like the right thing to do. Here is the 20th century's philosopher who revived rule consequentialism, R.F. Herod. He'll find it necessary to refine the crude utilitarian principle by applying the process of generalization in all relevant cases. He here being a philosopher who thinks about these issues and tries to be a consequentialist. Herod is saying it's important to actually think about the general pattern of action, not what promotes the good the best in this situation, but in general, think about the general rule for action, the general policy. Now, why do we have to do that? Well, partly because it is a basic ethical principle that we want to judge similar cases similarly, and so we want to be fair and consistent across the board, but partly also it's because we have to think about the tendencies of action. And how do I know what the tendency of this particular action is as performed by me? I don't have any way of knowing that except by thinking about the general rule and saying, well, in general, how does this thing work out? Okay, what are the consequences of following this rule in general? And that's how I determine the tendencies. So Herod's point, and it's actually a much more complicated argument than this, But in a way, the basic idea is, look, we have to apply the same rule to the same cases or to similar cases across the board to be consistent. But in addition to that, we have no way to really judge tendencies in individual cases except by looking at the general rule. Now, as I mentioned, these can diverge. It can turn out that in a certain situation, you can do the better thing or follow the better rule, but you can't do both. Okay? Sometimes those disagree when breaking the better rule could produce better consequences in that particular case. The examples of this, well, some of them are morally dramatic, where it seems as if I follow the general rule and do what's generally thought to be the right thing, I'm going to get us all in a lot of trouble, and the consequences of that will be terrible. But there are also very trivial cases. When I was a child, my father was driving, I think, back to our house from my grandparents' house. It wasn't very far, but you had to go up a hill, and up at the top of the hill was a stoplight. It was snowing that night. And he went up to the top of the hill, and I had been watching a show called Highway Patrol, which was on every early evening. And so I was learning all about traffic rules, and I loved cars as a kid. And so we were approaching the red light, and guess what? My father went through the red light. And I said, Daddy, red means stop. Green means go. And he said, well, look, yeah, you're right, of course. But in this case, if I stop on the hill, it's icy, I'm not going to be able to start up again. And there's nobody around, it's late at night. So I just decided it was best to go through the red light. I said, but red means stop. Well, what should you do in that case? The act utilitarian, or the act consequentialist more generally, is going to say do what has the best consequences. So in this case, yeah, don't get stuck on the hill. There's nobody around. There's no real risk, no real danger. Break the law. Go through the red light. But the rule consequentialist will say, but it's a good rule. But red means stop. Green means go. So in effect, my father was the act consequentialist. I was the rule consequentialist in the back seat, saying, no, you can't break the good rule. Anyway, that's a minor example, but it's the kind of tension that can happen all the time between these two versions of consequentialism. So it's not a trivial thing. And we'll come back to this because Maimonides and John Stuart Mill have a certain view of how you deal with these conflicts. But those aren't the only versions of consequentialism. We could focus on other parts of my diagram. So in particular, we could think about acts or general policies for action, but we could also think about motives or goals and think about those as fundamental. Consequently, we could take a step. You might say the most obvious thing to do here is to focus on the consequences of action. So most consequentialists are act consequentialists. But we can also think about the general kind of action. I didn't write that in here, but you might say intentions are never directed toward that exact action. Even if I intend to do something kind of specific, like point at this, there are many actions in particular that would count as pointings at this. So I'm really intending a kind of action. And so whenever we think in terms of intentions, we're really thinking about kinds of actions. And we might focus then on that and be a rule consequentialist. But we could also back it up and say, I want to be a decision consequentialist, or a motive consequentialist, or a goal consequentialist. And indeed, some people have been motive consequentialists. They've thought that's really what is fundamental. I think, again, about effects, but effects primarily of motives, not of actions or even rules for action. So Robert Adams, for example, has defended this view. One pattern of motivation is better than another to the extent that the former has more utility than the latter. In other words, my motives are better when they have better consequences. As he puts it here, they have more utility. So he's saying act on the better motive. What makes it a better motive has better consequences. There are other versions. We could talk in a kind of quasi-Aristotelian fashion about character. So we could back up further and say, think about character traits. And here's what you should do. You should act as a virtuous person would act. But what makes that person virtuous? Their character traits have good consequences. So one character trait is better than another if it has better consequences. What should you do? Act in a way that someone who has that better character trait would act. And that's a version that might be called virtue consequentialism or character consequentialism. People have defended that too. R.M. Hare, for example, in his book Moral Thinking, has a sort of two-level theory in which he evaluates character traits in terms of their consequences. And so in that case, we want to act in such a way that we manifest the better character trait. He, in effect, the reason I say it's a two-level theory is that he's something like an act consequentialist, or maybe a rule consequentialist, and a motive consequentialist. And he said, look, we think about motives and do moral thinking on both of those levels. And so we're doing both at the same time, thinking what kind of person should I be as well as what should I do in this particular case. And we're balancing out, usually, luckily they agree, but when they don't, then we have hard choices to make. And so he thinks we're really doing this in a kind of two-dimensional way. One, something like an act consequentialism, and one, basically a character consequentialism. Now we could even go further back. These are all individual in orientation. Individual people do things. They follow rules, they have motives, they have character traits. But we could then back up even further and talk about things that involve more than one person. So we could talk about social institutions, for example. We could say, here's what you should do. You should basically do what, well, fulfills your role within a certain kind of social institution. Hey, you're a professor at the university. You should fulfill your role. Do your job is basically the idea behind this form. Well, how do I know that that's the job I should be doing? Answer is, it has the best consequences. So, or maybe it's not really fair to say the job has the best consequences. You're playing your role in an institution that has good consequences. So in general, think what makes an institution better than another? It has better consequences. And then there's going to be certain roles that you play within such institutions. Play your role within that institution. That's a perfectly legitimate, though only recently investigated, form of consequentialism. Jeremy Evans is the person I think is most responsible for investigating this. On his view, one institution is better than another if it has better consequences. And you should play an appropriate role in preserving and strengthening good institutions. Play your role, do your job, basically, within a good institution. Do the best you can to preserve it and to make it stronger, to make it even better. Well, we can go further, but before we do, I want to stop here and think about that one for a moment, because it is something that most philosophers haven't thought a lot about. Here is the kind of thing that Evans is motivated by. Think about being a traffic engineer trying to design a system to handle traffic for a large city, Austin, let's say. How would you do it? Well, you can focus on small level things. You can focus on individual drivers, and then you can talk about traits, rules of the road, trying to make people defensive drivers and all of this. But primarily your job is to focus on the institution, to think about the design of automobiles, the design of traffic systems, the general design of highways and roads in such a way that they'll fulfill the goals that individual people have. They will get them to where they want to go safely and efficiently. And so at the level of institutions, you're going to be thinking about these large design questions. At the level of character and motives, you'll be thinking about the traits of good drivers, defensive drivers, drivers who have bad traits that cause accidents and who you want to penalize in some way by making them pay higher insurance rates, for example. And then there may well be individual things, traffic laws, as well as individual actions that are judged like traffic tickets. And so we can approach this problem, and do approach this problem, in a variety of different ways at once. But now, if we ask, okay, what makes a traffic law a good law? Evans' point is that really depends on the nature of our traffic system. Should we require that people do this or do that on a limited access highway? Well, it depends how we've designed the roads. What about this? When you are exiting from a highway and going on to another kind of road, do you have the right of way or not? What rule should we adopt? Well, Evans says it's not a question just of, in isolation, what are the consequences of that rule? It depends on how those roads are designed, how those off-ramps and on-ramps are designed. And so his point is, really, you start with the institution. You think, what's a good, efficient design? Now, in the end, that's judged by the consequences for individual people. It's not that you're somehow judging designs quite independently of the welfare of the drivers who are using those roads ultimately. No, of course, that's what really determines it. But you're thinking about those large level questions primarily. And then what makes something a good traffic law is that it plays the right kind of role in that overall traffic system. And then what are the good traits for a good driver to have? Well, it depends on what the traffic laws are, on what that system is like. And so being a good driver in a rural area might be different from being a good driver in New York City. That might be a very different thing from being a good driver in Bogota. So there are lots of different patterns here and lots of different ways of thinking about those questions, but they depend on the larger institution. So that's a legitimate form of consequentialism too. And it does tend to go nicely along with a general ethic of social roles. We've talked about that a little bit in connection with Confucius. You could say, what is my role in this system? And then you might think, well, really it's going to be some combination of these various relationships. Some of them communal, some of them just sort of market-driven, and then some of them a question of a vertical relationship or a horizontal relationship within something that isn't a relation among strangers, but instead a relation within some kind of hierarchy, maybe a family hierarchy or a business hierarchy, or something else like that, where I think, what is my role? What is my job with respect at least to this particular relationship? That's going to be fundamental if we think primarily in terms of institutions, because I'll be asked to fulfill my role within those institutions. There's one last kind of consequentialism I want to mention. We could back up even further and talk about entire civilizations, not just individual institutions. When we do that, we're thinking about the consequences of an entire civilization. And that means all of its social institutions, governmental institutions, religious institutions, educational institutions, various kinds of gatherings and clubs, and all the things that Edmund Burke referred to as the little platoons that constitute a society. We're thinking about that combination. And we're thinking we want that combination of things that constitute an entire civilization over time, over millennia. We want that to be good. We want to make that better. So how do we do that? Well, part of it is we do the right thing. Part of it is we follow the right rules. We have the right kind of character. We promote the welfare of the right kinds of institutions. But all of that is understood in the context of a larger civilization. And what our job is ultimately, according to this kind of view, is to promote, preserve, and strengthen the civilization we're part of. I think one person who's had such a view is Rudyard Kipling in his poetry. He's concerned in one poem that a tribe had been wiped off its ice field or the lights had gone out in Rome. Notice that's a consequence not just for an individual person, but an entire civilization. And he's thinking about what makes a successful civilization. He's worried about the consequences for civilization and the consequences of having a certain kind of civilization. So the general idea there is we should act to preserve and strengthen the institutions that themselves preserve and strengthen a good civilization. And then, of course, the rest follows. We should work to develop the character traits that better enable us to fulfill those roles. We should act in accordance with those character traits. Well, what makes a better civilization better? Again, it's not some abstract thing that's communally defined. Some people have that kind of view. We might have that kind of view. Oh, it's harmony or justice or equality or something at that broad social level. But we don't have to. Somebody who has the view of Evans or the view of Kipling is going to say, no, the measure is still individual welfare, the good for individual human beings. So what makes a civilization better? It's better for the people in it. What makes an institution better? It's better for the people who play roles in it. It's better in general in terms of its consequences. Well, if that's right, we might say, then the aim here of that kind of consequentialism isn't just that my individual action be good or that my rule for action or character trait be good. It's that civilization be good. In fact, as good as possible. So there are many different paths, many different versions of consequentialism, and many different paths to thinking about any individual action or rule or motive or character trait or institution or civilization. In the end, for a consequentialist, the value of all of those is going to depend on consequences. But the consequences of what? And how do we measure those consequences? Their consequentialisms are going to differ. So what we're going to do today, subsequently in lectures, is look at various important versions of consequentialism and see exactly how they work out that path.